Thank you, Renata. Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. I must apologize in advance. My voice sounds a bit weird because I've been sick, but I'll try to make it as clear as possible. I wanted to make my talk a little more focused on the Human Rights Council and recommendations about what people here at the Council can do to try and help the human rights situation inside Bahrain. Before I do that, of course, for anyone interested in how successful the Bahraini government has been in actually implementing the recommendation of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, there was a report called the BICI Reforms that was put out by local NGOs in Bahrain, which specifically talks about the recommendations and whether or not they've been implemented in Bahrain by the government. Of course, the government likes to say that they've implemented almost all of them, but we found evidence and documentation that they've implemented almost none of them. The very few that have been implemented, even the way of implementation sometimes is not fully not in the way where it allows the human rights situation to actually get better. And an example, a very quick example of that is after they did install cameras in some police stations, which was a requirement or a recommendation by the BICI report, they then set up unofficial torture centers in different areas. For example, the Sanabis Youth Hostel is one of them, and these unofficial torture centers were actually documented not only by local NGOs such as the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, but even international NGOs like Human Rights Watch. So that report is available on the table over there. And also to just give you a more general picture of the situation in Bahrain, the human rights violations are still ongoing almost on a daily basis. Unfortunately, as human rights defenders, we had hoped that the several occasions that have been presented to the Bahraini government to actually create reforms or to take steps in the right direction to create a situation where the human rights violations can be stopped, they actually chose not to take. And what we're seeing today is a deterioration of the human rights situation in the country. And I think that, to a large part, this is due to the culture of impunity that is implemented from the very highest levels of the government in Bahrain, and which allows people to continue to commit human rights violations. When we know that certain members of the ruling family or very high officials in the government were involved, sometimes directly in the torture of political prisoners, and then they are allowed to stay in their positions or at times even given promotions, this does not stop torture in the country. This allows it to continue. And that's one of the problems. But I think even further than that, international immunity for the Bahraini government always also feeds into the culture of continuing human rights violations inside Bahrain, because the Bahraini government has now reached a point where they believe that despite all of their human rights violations, they can continue to do what they do and they will not have to face any kind of consequences on the international level. So I have 4 recommendations, and I'll try to keep it very brief. The Bahraini government, of course, has said that they've accepted all of the BICI recommendations. I think it's about time that they actually implement them. It's not enough for them to only accept them, but we need to see real steps taken on the ground to stop human rights violations and to hold people accountable for the things that have been documented in the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry. The second recommendation is, and I would like to start by welcoming the joint statement that was led by Switzerland, where we received 44 different countries signing on to the joint statement under item 4, which is almost double the amount of countries that signed on last time, which was, I believe, 27, which is a great sign. But I think that we're at a point right now in Bahrain where we need a stronger reaction. I think that what we would recommend here as human rights groups from Bahrain is more of a resolution that sets up a fact-finding mission. This fact-finding mission would focus on things like the release of all political prisoners, to investigate and seize all acts of torture, to refrain from reprisals. One of the things that we've seen that is very worrying, that because of this understanding that the Bahraini government has, there's a lack of accountability for the Bahraini government internationally. We have even faced reprisals inside the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. And this is something that wouldn't happen a year ago. This is something that happened in the last session, because the Bahraini government now feels comfortable enough to have people accredited by the mission targeting and harassing activists and human rights defenders that come to Geneva to talk about human rights violations. And then also to stop the use of excessive force against protesters in the context of peaceful protests. My third recommendation is to encourage the Bahraini government to accept a full mandate office for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and not just technical support. We understand that there's a conversation or ongoing dialogue about this right now, and it would really help to get pressure from countries and from the Human Rights Council to tell the Bahraini government to accept that the Office of the High Commissioner open an office in Bahrain, but that they have a full mandate and not just technical support, as this could help better the human rights situation on the ground. And finally, my last recommendation is to encourage the EU, the European Union, to hold accountable companies and businesses which enable human rights violations in Bahrain by providing internet surveillance and spyware technologies. We've seen over and over again, and not just in Bahrain, we've seen this in Syria as well, and we've seen this in other countries, where companies that are located in the EU actually sell the technology that enables these governments to commit human rights violations, like targeting human rights defenders and activists, locating where they are, collecting data on them, and even amounts to torture sometimes. And I think it's about time that we have measures and mechanisms which allow for holding these companies and businesses accountable for enabling human rights violations.